The 13th of September 1944, over southern England, a brand new British fighter is being pushed through an improvised low-altitude mock combat with a standard Spitfire Mk-14. The pilot is Frank Furlong. The aircraft is not supposed to be dangerous. It is supposed to be the future, but something goes wrong. The aeroplane flicks, control is lost, and within moments, Britain's next great piston fighter is a smoking crater. The investigation cannot even agree on why. An aileron jam, a linkage fault, a brief seizure under G, no definitive cause is ever proved, and the tragedy lands at the worst possible time, because in 1944, the RAF isn't just fighting UFL-190S and BFL-109S anymore. It is staring down VFL-101 flying bombs, the first operational jet fighters, and the unsettling realization that faster is no longer enough. Still, on paper, this aircraft promises everything the Spitfire could not. A wing built for near transonic dives, a roll rate meant to embarrass anything in the sky, on a landing gear wide enough to stop killing pilots on muddy grass strips. It was built to replace the Spitfire. It was ordered in the hundreds. It could do nearly 500 miles an hour in level flight. And hardly anybody remembers its name? Not yet. By 1942, the Spitfire was already becoming a victim of its own success. The airframe that had looked so sleek in 1936 was being asked to do things its designer, R. J. Mitchell, never lived to see: carry heavier cannon armament, tolerate far more power, and remain controllable as it approached compressibility effects at high speed. The problem was subtle and therefore annoying. Late-war Spitfires were fast enough that in steep dives, airflow over portions of the wing could begin to behave badly. Shockwaves, buffeting, and control changes that arrived like a rude tap on the shoulder at 450 to 480 miles per hour. Supermarine's famous elliptical wing, continuously strengthened through the war, was reaching the edge of its development margin. So, in September 1942, the Air Ministry asked Supermarine for something that sounds almost casual but wasn't: devise a new wing to improve high-speed behavior and rolling performance. Supermarine answered with its own internal specification 470, issued the 30th of November 1942, outlining a wing designed to reduce profile drag, raise the critical speed where compressibility drag surged, and deliver a faster roll rate than any existing fighter. Wing area would drop from 242 square feet to 210. Thickness to chord would taper aggressively, down to about 8% at the tip. The man steering this was Joseph Smith, Supermarine's chief designer, who had inherited the Spitfire program after Mitchell's death. British engineering history is filled with men like Smith, not always romanticized, rarely quoted on posters, yet responsible for making famous machines survive contact with reality. The wing itself was the revolution. Instead of the Spitfire's curved elegance, the new planform was straight-tapered, metal-skinned, thick enough at the root to swallow inward retracting landing gear, and built around a laminar flow type section. Now, laminar flow is one of those phrases that sounds like it should come with a free pipe and slippers. In practice, it meant trying to keep airflow smooth further back along the chord, reducing skin friction drag. The theory was seductive. The reality was less polite. NASA's historical airfoil work shows how these low-drag sections were meant to maintain laminar flow over 60 to 70% of the chord in ideal conditions. Ideal conditions are not traditionally a feature of wartime airfields. In February 1943, the Air Ministry formalized the idea under Specification F, 143rd, a single-seat fighter with a laminar flow wing, 420 mm Hispano cannon, and provisions for folding wings in case the Fleet Air Arm wanted a naval version. Contra-rotating propellers were also contemplated because late Griffon power could make takeoffs exciting in all the wrong ways. The prototype path was pragmatic. Rather than wait for an entirely new airframe, Supermarine bolted the new Type 371 wing onto a Spitfire Mk-14 fuselage. That aircraft, serial NN660, flew on the 30th of June 1944 with Geoffrey Quill at the controls from RAF High Post in Wiltshire. Quill was no ordinary test pilot. He was Supermarine's voice of reason in a world that frequently tried to replace reason with urgency. And at first it worked. NN660 was faster than a standard Spitfire 14. The wing did what it promised at speed. However, the stall was a different story. Where the Spitfire's elliptical wing tended to stall gently from the root outward, often preserving aileron authority longer, the new wing could bite first at the tip. That is the aerodynamic equivalent of having your steering wheel fall off right when you most need it. Then came the September crash. NN 660 was lost on the 13th of September 1944 during that mock dogfight. Frank Furlong was killed. The subsequent discussion included the possibility of aileron control issues, and Quill himself later experienced an aileron jam in another prototype, but had enough altitude to recover. Controls were redesigned, progress slowed, the ministry complained, the clock kept ticking, and yet despite the crash, despite the delays, despite the uncomfortable truth that jets were coming, Supermarine pressed on, because by late 1944, Britain still needed the best piston fighter it could possibly field, just in case. But what would happen when this sleek new wing met the messy reality of service trials? The Spiteful's service history is in one sense brutally simple. It never reached an operational squadron. No D-Day stripes, no victory tallies, no desperate dawn scrambles. But that simplicity hides a far more revealing story, because the Spiteful became a test case for a whole generation of aviation assumptions about wings, manufacturing, maintenance, and what better actually meant at the end of the piston era. To understand the Spiteful's operational life, you have to follow the prototypes. After NN 660, the second prototype, NN 664, finally flew on the 8th of January 1945, again with Geoffrey Quill. This was closer to the intended aircraft, with a revised fuselage and a bubble canopy giving improved visibility, something the Air Ministry wanted for modern deflection shooting. The tail at first resembled the Spitfire .21 S, but handling tests kept pushing Supermarine toward a larger fin, rudder, and tailplane. The bigger tail improved control, but inevitably cost speed. This was the Spiteful's first great irony. It was being built to go faster by reducing drag, yet it kept gaining fixes that increased drag because pilots do not sign up to be passengers in a ballistic experiment. And then there was laminar flow itself. The laminar wing's promise depended on surface condition. In control tests, it behaved beautifully. In practice, even minor imperfections could disrupt the smooth boundary layer, panel misalignments, paint texture, mud, and famously dead insects. The wing could be fast, but it could also be fussy, and war does not do fussy. Still, Supermarine and the Air Ministry had sunk enough effort into the program that orders arrived, large ones. At one point, total orders were projected in the hundreds, with Wikipedia noting 650 ordered before successive cancellations chopped the figure down, first to 390, then to 80, then to 22. The intention was clear. If the Spiteful delivered a meaningful advantage, it would replace late Griffon Spitfires in production. The Spitfire name itself was even debated at Air Council level, with alternatives like Victor and Valiant floating around before Spiteful was accepted. It is oddly fitting, an aeroplane born out of aerodynamic spite toward compressibility. The first production aircraft, RB 515, flew on the 2nd of April 1945. Quill was again at the controls. Its official designation was Spiteful FMEC 14, deliberately carrying over the X-14 lineage from the Spitfire Mech 14 to simplify the paperwork, because nothing says we're building a radically new aircraft, like trying to pretend it's basically the same one. RB 515's career became a miniature summary of the whole program: promise, interruption, repair, and another interruption. A week after its maiden flight, it suffered damage during a forced landing at Boscombe Down, was repaired, returned to flight, and later suffered further trouble. Now let's talk about what the Spiteful actually was by 1945, because the numbers matter, but only if we explain why they mattered. A Spiteful FMK-14 used a Rolls-Royce Griffon 69, producing around 2,375 horsepower, driving a 5-bladed Rotol propeller. The aircraft was about 32 feet, 11 inches long, with a wingspan around 35 feet and wing area of 210 square feet. Top speed was about 483 miles per hour at 21,000 feet, with a service ceiling around 42,000 feet and climb rate approaching 4,890 feet per minute in initial climb figures. Armament was 420 mm's Hispano Mech 5 cannon. This is the point where the Spiteful starts to sound like a monster. And it was at altitude, at speed, in clean conditions. But fighter aircraft are judged by more than a maximum speed line on a graph. They are judged by how quickly they can be turned around, rearmed, refueled, and launched again by tired ground crews in the rain, under time pressure, with an officer asking why it isn't done yet. When the Spiteful prototypes went to the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at RAF Boscombe Down, The results were not the sort of enthusiastic endorsement that triggers mass production. Wikipedia records an assessment described as below average, including criticism of cockpit layout and the time required to refuel and rearm. Old Machine Press goes further on what that meant mechanically, removing the engine cowling required, undoing numerous fasteners, rearming could be time-consuming, and at least one evaluation raised concerns about build quality and serviceability. And here the Spiteful ran into its second great irony. Supermarine had simplified the wing platform, straight edges, less complex curvature, partly to ease manufacture, yet the aircraft still emerged as an awkward customer to maintain at precisely the stage of the war when the RAF wanted mature, reliable systems, not a new maintenance personality. Meanwhile, the world changed around it. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. Jet aircraft were no longer a rumor or a prototype. They were the obvious future. Britain already had the Gloucester Meteor in service, and Supermarine itself was looking to adapt the Spiteful's wing into a jet fighter, what would become the Attacker. So what did the RAF do with a fighter that was fast but late and not clearly superior in the ways that mattered? It hesitated, it reduced orders, it reframed the requirement. By March 1946, Supermarine was reportedly told the RAF only needed the Spiteful as a low-altitude attack aircraft, and when the company objected, the project was finally abandoned. In July 1948, many airframes were sold for scrap. 19 aircraft were built, including 3 prototypes. That number alone explains why the Spiteful feels like a ghost. It never had the chance to become common. But the story doesn't end with the RAF's indifference, because one Spiteful did something unforgettable. RB 518 was converted and used for further development work, becoming associated with the Spiteful FMK-16 designation in some accounts. In 1947, it achieved 494 miles per hour at altitude, often cited as a record-level flight speed for a British piston-engined aircraft. Old Machine Press also notes RB 518's testing was plagued by forced landings, and the airframe ultimately suffered damage that ended any realistic hope of preservation. So the Spiteful could be blisteringly fast. It just could not become operationally indispensable quickly enough to matter. At this point, you might reasonably ask, if the Spiteful was too late for the RAF, what about the Royal Navy? The Admiralty had its own problem. Carrier aviation was entering a dangerous transition. Early jets existed, but there was real uncertainty about whether jet fighters could operate effectively from existing carriers, takeoff run, throttle response, deck handling, fuel consumption, all of it. So a navalized Spiteful was pursued, the Supermarine Seafang. The Seafang was designed to specification N, 545ths, and built around familiar naval necessities, arrestor hook, folding wings, and critically contra-rotating propellers to eliminate torque swing on takeoff and go-around. If you have ever watched a powerful single-prop aircraft yaw aggressively with throttle, imagine doing it on a short wet deck with a parked aircraft ahead and the sea behind. The Royal Navy, to its credit, preferred not to. The Seafang FMEC-32 prototype VB-895 first flew in June 1946, and in May 1947, test pilot Mike Lithgow carried out deck landing trials aboard HMS Illustrious. Reports noted the wide-track landing gear improved deck stability and the contra-rotating propellers reduced torque effects exactly as intended, and yet it still wasn't enough. Compared to the Seafire 5.47, the Seafire's performance advantage was not judged sufficient to justify disruption, especially with naval jets on the horizon and other excellent piston options available, like the Hawker Sea Fury. The Seafire suffered from the same basic low-speed handling disappointments that haunted the Spiteful's wing philosophy. The Fleet Air Arm ordered only small numbers, 18 built and moved on. So what in the end did the Spiteful do in service? It proved that the Spitfire's next step could be faster, but not necessarily better. It validated a wing concept that would live on in the Supermarine attacker jet, and it exposed the uncomfortable truth that late-war aviation progress was no longer linear. You couldn't simply refine your way out of the piston era. You had to leave it behind, and that is why the Spiteful, built to replace a legend, never got the chance to become one. The Spiteful's retirement was not marked by a grand farewell. It was marked by cancellation notices, shrinking contracts, and the sound of jet engines growing louder on the horizon. By May 1945, as Europe's war ended, the Spiteful's order was cancelled, with only a handful completed, and the remaining aircraft were used for evaluation rather than squadron service. Later, many were scrapped, Final production was tiny, 19 built including prototypes. That is not rare, it is barely existed. And, unlike many obscure types, the Spiteful left no comforting museum hall full of aluminium-proof, old machine press notes that no examples survive, so the aircraft that was meant to succeed the Spitfire has in a literal sense been erased, leaving photographs, paperwork, and the occasional model kit to do the remembering. The usual myth is that the Spitfire was a super Spitfire that would have dominated if only it had arrived earlier, while it's true that its speed was exceptional, culminating in that 494 miles per hour figure associated with RB 518. Post-war analysis and trials feedback suggest a more balanced view. It was fast, but it did not deliver the all-round improvement needed to justify replacing late Griffon Spitfires in quantity. It also introduced new handling and serviceability headaches at precisely the moment the RAF was becoming intolerant of new headaches. Another misconception is that laminar flow wings were an automatic upgrade. NASA's own historical airfoil material makes the key point. These sections were designed for extended laminar flow under carefully controlled conditions. Combat aircraft rarely enjoy carefully controlled conditions. The Spiteful demonstrated that performance tied to surface perfection is performance you may not be able to bank on in the field. So how should we judge it? As a fighter that never fought, the Spiteful is easy to dismiss. But as an engineering waypoint, it matters. It represented Supermarine's attempt to solve the Spitfire's high-speed limitations with a clean-sheet wing, improved ground handling through inward retracting wide-track gear, and the brute force of late Griffon power, an engine family so significant that the Science Museum Group summarizes the Griffon as a 37-liter supercharged V12 that replaced Merlin power in late Spitfires. And perhaps most importantly, it proved something that aviation history teaches again and again: being the best piston fighter in 1945 was like being the best steam locomotive in 1955. You could be brilliant, you could be beautiful, you could even be fast enough to rewrite record books, but you were no longer the answer to the question being asked. The Spitfire became legend because it arrived when Britain needed it most. The Spitfire arrived when the world had already decided to move on.